All right, so we should be live in our Ask Us Anything for Midstage Startups. These are the open office hours that we are doing on a regular basis. Hello, Doug, can you hear me?
Yes, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all of you out there.
Excellent, very good, very good. Okay, Doug, so I'm going to let you lead this because you've been gathering a lot of questions from people already in anticipation of these office hours. And of course, some people will also add live questions to the chat. So please, if you do have any questions, add them to the chat on LinkedIn or YouTube, whichever channel you're using to look at this open office hour. So, Doug, take it away.
Okay,
I'll try
so
and
we have
answer
so
whatever
many,
we can.
yeah, so we have so many questions. I'm going to do a spinner across I think we have 36 right now. And let me see.
Wow.
Okay, it wants us to go to number 35. So this is Olivia, a VP of HR in San Francisco. What are some effective team building activities for a leadership offsite that aren't cheesy, forced, and again are effective
Effective team building activities, yeah,
for leadership teams
for a
offsite?
leadership team. Okay. Well, I may come back with a provocative answer to that. I think the most effective team building activity is typically the workshop itself. And I know I'm in a minority position there, but we actually believe that when we do a workshop, it is the work that people do in the workshop that is the most productive in getting them to work better as a team. And what that means is that we need to optimize the workshop for as much work in little groups as possible. Typically, also trying to use random groups or even setting up little groups that pair people together that normally don't work well together or are in different functions. And we really give them small, feasible assignments that make them feel like they're productive, they're contributing, they're part of the full team offsite setup. And this, in our experience, is what makes people feel really like a team building activity happens. So that doesn't mean I'm against things like going for a bike ride or, doing some drinking afterwards. Of course, that's also important. But I think in most other workshops, we see too much of a separation between, oh, let's just sit through the boring presentations for 8 hours and then let's do team building as something fun. I do not agree with that.
Hey, Roland, I know some people on the call are very familiar with the velocity system and are using it, and
Yeah.
maybe some of the others aren't. So when you say workshops, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. In the velocity system setting, can you sort of explain what the workshop is and kind of the cadence of that? Not don't go too salesy, but just make sure people have context.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for calling that out. You know me, I'm never too salesy. I would say in the velocity system, typically we want startups to do 4 workshops, offsite sessions, whatever you want to call them, 4 times per year. The executive team, the leadership team needs to get together to really talk in a concentrated way about what has happened in the last quarter, what are the big gaps we need to fill, and what are our plans for the next quarter. And they need to get to that point where at the end of that workshop, they have all agreed on these are the priorities for our team at large. These are the owners for each of the priorities. This is how we will measure progress. And maybe most importantly, these are all the things we will not focus on for this quarter.
Right, the famous not now list. We're
The
not going to work
famous
on
not
them
now
now,
list.
right? It's not a no, it's a not now. I love that. Thank you for explaining that. Let me spin it again. Okay, let me scroll down on the page. Okay, so Sophie, who's a head of operations in Milan, what are some effective ways to cascade OKRs down to individual team members? And I guess, Roland, I would just ask, we're talking about mid-stage companies here, but maybe on the smaller side, if you're only 50 people versus if you're on the bigger side to 150, does that change your answer at all?
It does, absolutely. Yeah. I would say at the smaller side when, and hello, buongiorno, Sophie, if you are in Milan, I think you said,
Yep.
then the cascading is very different. So I would say at the smaller side of the scale, Companies primarily make the mistake, in my mind, that they want to cascade OKRs or KPIs to frontline team members before the executives have even agreed to theirs. And so it's really more about this anxiety about what did we hire all these people for? What are they actually doing? I want them to be on objectives. I want them to be on KPIs. But at the leadership team level itself, they have not actually established yet real responsibilities, real accountability, real cadence of follow-up. And so that almost always fails. If you start with trying to roll out OKRs, KPIs across the company, at the same time for executives as for frontline leaders, it doesn't work. So at that level, I would say very first priority is get OKRs and KPIs working at the leadership team level first, 1 quarter. Next quarter, you can then cascade one level below, like the middle managers, whatever you have in a company of 50. And then at the end, you can cascade further, often actually only at a frontline team level rather than to individuals, but that's a separate story. For a much bigger company, when you can assume that some of these OKRs and KPIs for leadership team levels are in place, we typically like to work with what we call the W model, where it's an intersection between what are targets being set from the higher level down, and then the lower level up proposes OKRs or KPIs that actually fill or fulfill, I should say, those targets. And then there is some negotiation phase, essentially, where right before the beginning of the quarter, they all agree, like, okay, this is what we settle on. This is going to be the team initiative that we back up because it buys into the targets that we set top down.
I think very well said. And I think the only thing I would add to all of that is, this is all about balancing. You don't want to be too corporate. You don't want to be too chaotic. You want to be in the middle. So I think a lot of it, and Roland putting out kind of the size component, is right now, are OKRs being hit consistently? And are you performing well in an OKR perspective? And are you getting the growth or the business outcomes you want? If that's the case, you're probably not setting aggressive enough OKRs in the right areas and maybe setting too many easy ones. Versus, on the other hand, if you're never hitting your OKRs, maybe you're setting too many cascading. So there's got to be some situational awareness there.
Yeah, I would definitely say for the technologists among us, OKRs are not instrumentation, right? So in products, we call this instrumentation, where you basically measure every single click and every single action that people take anywhere on the website. And you try to measure as much as possible so that sometime in the future, you can start actually managing some of these metrics. That is a pattern that absolutely fails in companies. A very key thing here is to set as few as possible, not as many as possible. We've actually had success with many companies where we started out with just one OKR for the entire company for the first quarter. And this is probably the best method to get people to really rally around that one objective. Over time, you can then expand to 2 or 3, but we would say never go even beyond 5. Not even when you're a 100-people company or bigger.
And Roland, I would just echo, thinking back a little bit over a decade ago when I was working in Adobe systems. Mm-hmm. At one point, they had a profit-sharing scheme, not a scheme, a profit-sharing program, where if you're an employee and they hit their earnings per share, you got a 10% quarterly bonus. And everyone got that. And it made it very clear to everyone, regardless what your job was, it was critically important for Adobe to hit its earning per shares number. And that enabled it to acquire a lot of companies, to invest in growth and do everything else. And a really simple example of not what you would call an OKR, but a very common priority that every employee at a 2,000-person company had.
Yeah, I mean, this actually sparks me remembering, like, one of the clients was complaining that they weren't hitting their sales targets. And of course, the whole executive team was piling on the sales team. Why are we not hitting our sales targets? And one of the questions I asked them, like, who's actually incentivized to meet the sales targets? And it was just the frontline salespeople, not even the sales executives were incentivized. So we changed that exactly to your point and said, well, next quarter, everyone in the company is going to get some kind of a bonus based on whether the company hits the sales targets. And yeah, salespeople may get some more, But in the end, that's where everyone started to see, even I in engineering, even I in accounting, have a responsibility to make more sales happen.
Right. Very well said. By the way, piling on that, I'm going to go off the list just because another sales question here. So this is John, the CEO in New Mexico. We always paid our salespeople on revenue minus COGS, right? Not top line. And as he tries to recruit senior sales leader to take them to the next level, they all say that they can't hire good salespeople who will get paid that way. Are they correct? And why should I comp sales on top line revenue, not revenue minus COGS?
Okay, so for those that are not finance people, essentially they are rewarding people based on the gross margin that they generated rather than the revenue, right? So after the cost. I assume this is a business model where the COGS, the cost of goods sold, is really high, so the gross margin is not that high, and therefore there's a big difference between revenue and the margin being generated. I would generally say, like, it should reflect the business model. So if this is a key aspect of the business model, then that does make sense. However, salespeople love to think in big numbers, and they love to take personal credit for, like, I got this $1 million deal or something like that. I would probably just adjust the mechanics a little bit and think of margins more as like a minimum. So what I've seen work really well in other companies is where they said, you do get compensated on the gross revenue of the deal. However, any deal below, let's say $10,000 doesn't count, or it should be at least X% margin before it counts. Otherwise, you get nothing. And I think that is often a more motivating way to have salespeople really jump at the budget. I think part of it is also that in their CV and in their career, they basically want to be able to show the high numbers that they sold, and that is more in line with their thinking. So just like you try to work with customers and understand their own language and try to market your products in their language, the same goes for certain constituents of employees. And so, try to sell things to salespeople the way they want to be sold to. Do the same with accountants, do the same with engineers.
What about, I'm just thinking as you said that, Roland, about the sort of question of if sales is given a price sheet, or, here's how much you sell this product for, here's how much, is it their job to then manage the margin? Or does that then maybe suck them in too much from getting new business?
So what I've seen work best is that it's the sales sheet or the pricing sheet that actually manages the margin up front. And then there's probably an escalation mechanism, like, oh, but this customer is really special. And the sales manager will typically tell their salespeople, you get only one escalation per quarter, not constant escalations. Right. That works. But it's really the underlying system that you are going to be scaling. There needs to be some kind of a pricing sheet, or call it a quote configurator, or whatever you need. Often it's just a wrapped together spreadsheet in a company that works the best, actually. Right. But people need to have guidelines, and most importantly, they need to have those guidelines before they start telling the customer what they can do.
Right. And not being able to ask John the question back, because I think he may have left. I would want to know from him how standard is his pricing and how standard are their templates, because I've seen in some cases with clients we work with who pay off of this sort of net margin, it might be because they are avoiding the work of setting hard floors and setting prices and taking deals, and maybe too flexible and aren't focused enough on an ICP.
This is a very good point. One that doesn't just apply to pricing, but to a lot of startup management in general. Do not just delegate out of laziness and then be surprised that people come back time and time again to ask you, but is this okay, right? It is much better to put in the work a little bit up front and say, okay, here's the system that will apply in 80-90% of the cases. This is what you can run with. And now you can always call me for an exception. but too many leaders don't quite know yet what their pricing strategy will be in this case. And so they say, oh, just go out there, see what is acceptable, and then just run it by me. That's fine if you're like early stage, but it does not work anymore as you start scaling.
Totally. I think that was very well said. Now that we've got a question from Nilesh, he is in Bangalore. As a technical founder, and with only a technical co-founding team, what's the best next step to expand outside our first 20 beta customers?
Okay, so generally you do need to start working on building some kind of go-to-market capacity, and that's different from just your technical team. I would say at the level of about 20 total employees, I understood, all right?
They said they have 20 beta customers, and now they want to expand. They didn't say the number of employees.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay, well, with 20 customers, you have some repeatability usually. So that does mean you have a bit of a playbook in your head. It also means you've probably sold those yourself as a founder. So at that time, I would say it's definitely important to get in your first full-time salesperson, probably mid-level, maybe a bit junior to mid-level, who can basically start applying your playbook. So expect a lot of hand-holding, expect a lot of coaching. And maybe in the beginning, it's just somebody who does the door opening, who does a lot of outreach and books you meetings, just to get the playbook up and running. I would not start yet with hiring like a chief revenue officer or a VP of sales. Get to hiring a few team members first before you start hiring management. And I think those team members will basically start standardizing your playbook as you tell it to them. And then over time, you can start adding other go-to-market aspects, such as a bit of marketing, a bit of customer success.
By the way, I think that was really well said. I think the only thing I would add to that is I would look into those 20 beta customers, not to determine who you should go after, but to have a hypothesis or two, and then plan with that new hire, which I totally agree with, to prove or disprove those hypotheses. Because maybe those 20 initial beta customers are exactly who you're going to be able to scale, and maybe you can't scale because they're sort of unicorns. But I think that was really good advice. But always kind of do a little bit of analysis on the past to come up with opinions, but always prove and disprove those. Don't take those as true.
Yeah, a very simple thing to do with those 20 beta customers is like, who out of these 20 is actually what we would consider an ideal customer, right? Those that are very happy with our product or services, those that pay us on time, those that refer us to their friends. Those are probably the ones you want to focus on. And the founder of Superhuman, the email client, has made such great posts about finding product market fit, really by focusing in on only one core group of ideal customers and simply not building features or marketing for any of the adjacent groups.
Awesome. Let me spin the wheel here. Okay, so Zara, the VP of Engineering from Tel Aviv. Hi. Hope everybody's safe there. What are effective strategies for holding team members accountable without micromanaging? Oh, what a good question.
That is a great question, and one that a lot of people ask us, right? So the very first root cause of micromanaging is, in my mind, is that people do not set expectations in the first place. So they will set a very vague remit, like you're responsible for marketing or you're responsible for operations. And it doesn't actually say like what the expected result is or how should people go about that. And then the only thing people can do is constantly come to you with their plans or ideas or questions and run everything by you. And then as a founder or CEO, you'll go like, well, I would do this differently, I would do that differently. There you are, you're in micromanagement right away, right? Now, the better strategy would be to say, I hold you accountable for marketing, which means that I need you to generate leads. In the end, if you don't generate leads, this job is not going to be there. And yes, I understand there's going to be things like branding and events and, outreach and all that other stuff, database management. All of these things you'll probably need to generate leads effectively. But I judge you by the leads you generate. Peter Thiel, when he was the CEO founder of PayPal, was very famous for that. He said, I have only one number for every person who reports to me. And if they have any question that has nothing to do with that number, I don't want to talk to them about it, because it's all just distractions from them hitting that number. So definitely not the most empathetic person, of course, to be reporting to, but it did help a lot in getting people hyper focused on that area. And then also, when you have that system in place and you say, look, your only responsibility here is lead generation, how you get there is your job. I just want to see the leads coming in. That actually provides a bit of a backbone, even a way for the junior person to say to their boss, well, back off. Let me run the lead generation. That's what you said you needed, right?
Right. And I would just add to that, because I remember earlier in my career, I'd be very uncomfortable because, well, if I drive the leads and they're not good quality, like what are all of these things? But I think with the velocity system, sorry to put a plug in for us, but you're going to pick that for a 13-week sprint until you do your next planning. So if the goal of marketing is, hey, you need to get 13,000 leads into the pipeline, at the end of the next quarter, you can then say, well, did you get 13,000 leads? Okay, now do we have a lead problem or do we have a lead quality problem?
Exactly.
Right? And then you can say, okay, now the goal is, hey, we don't need that many leads. We need this many higher quality leads, but at least you'll have more data to make that decision. So
exactly, very good point. And I think that this is the other error many people make, even if they do set KPIs, that they want to set all those parameters at the same time. They don't even make a differentiation between what's the key goal and what's the constraint. And as you're saying, it's much better to just separate that out, set one goal every quarter, and then it's totally fine to set a different goal the next quarter. It's normal that, let's say, when for HR recruitment, you set a goal like, no matter what, we need to hire 100 people this quarter, that the next quarter you're going to have a problem with, like, well, but how many of these were properly onboarded? Or maybe the quarter after you're going to have a problem with, well, we have too many low quality people that we hired. That's normal. But if you want to then the next quarter set a different target, next quarter set a different target, and cycle through those targets rather than trying to set them all at once, because that just creates paralysis.
Right. And I do have to say, the one thing that just really came through from your comment there, Roland, is it's really important to build the muscle of setting targets and hitting them.
Yes.
And to some extent, initially, it doesn't matter what the targets are. That sounds crazy. But just setting targets and hitting them, as you get into that sort of muscle building mode, then you can set better targets over time, and that'll unleash the value of your company and your organization.
Yeah, I think it's right. And I mean, yes, it sounds radical to say it doesn't matter what the target is, but over time, that is definitely true. When we work with people, and I think actually people like personal trainers have a similar experience, right? Like in the very beginning, the client may want to set a target of wanting to do one push-up, and maybe like a year later, they can do many more push-ups, but they've also realized that push-ups is not actually the main thing that will drive their health, right? And so they'll set different targets over time. It's actually a very similar system. Your point is very valid, Doug, because I think the part that people are missing is setting targets is ultimately about building confidence in people's own abilities, in giving them confidence that they can actually deliver to a target, and not getting all that confidence from the founder all the time.
Really, really well said. Yeah. A question. Oh no, now I've lost it. Hang on one second. Let's go to Isabel, from another one from Milan. How should we adapt our OKRs and planning process as we scale and face increasing regulatory requirements?
Okay, well, that's a question that would probably take some good question and answer session with the company to understand the exact situation that they're in. But generally, I would say companies operating in a regulatory environment need to see that as a key constraint on the business. It usually means that you have to have people responsible for meeting regulatory requirements, but also not considering those requirements as something like a customer. Meeting regulatory requirements is not going to make you successful as a business. It just makes sure you don't have the downside of being taken out of business, right? So very often we actually advise people to meet the very minimum of the regulatory requirements as a strategy. And that means ticking the boxes, hitting 6 out of 10, or a C or a D out of a A in an American grading system, trying to get to the very minimum so that it's just enough, but that you can spend most of your other energy on the key things that will actually drive the business, such as how do we get more sales, how do we get better positioning, how do we build a new product, how do we add a new geography. So now to say that back to the OKR system, typically we like to think of OKRs as the key drivers that will remove a next roadblock. And that could be that you need to get your regulatory environment up to scratch and hit that minimum. In that case, it could be an OKR. It could also be that you are saying, it's actually other things that are more of roadblocks to business success. And in that case, the head of regulatory should basically try to stabilize the regulatory compliance, but not try to overdo it and get further down, especially if it holds back, let's say, the business side.
Okay, very well said. And I'll leave you alone with the regulatory requirements. Okay, very much, Isabella.
But of course, I mean, like companies that do not work in a regulatory environment are very lucky that way. But if you decided to run a fintech company or whatever, you cannot ignore regulatory requirements.
And if you can navigate them well, they can be a differentiated advantage and protect you from other competitors.
Absolutely. But it's also one reason why typical investment in fintech needs to be a lot higher upfront, because the barriers to entry are higher that way, right?
Right. So we've got a question from Takashi, a CFO in New York. How do you think about what the most important financial metrics a company needs to have to attract Series B funding?
Okay, so this is really the metrics at the investor level, which is kind of like the top in our velocity framework, I would say. Almost always it's just the absolute ARR, or average annual recurring revenue that people have reached, right? So if you're not in the ballpark of 5 to 10 million, then you're not even going to be a candidate for Series B typically. And this number has gone up, by the way, since the funding climate has gone less attractive. So basically people are only going for the top of the list right now. The second, maybe more important one is like underlying how big has ARR growth been? Are you on that trajectory of triple, double the revenue every year? Or has it been really slow growth? In that case, you're probably out. And then I would say, while Series B is still primarily about really maximizing the growth, people will already look very carefully at when are you breaking even on your customer acquisition expenses, right? So they may not look at overall profitability that much, but they will look very much at when you spend more to acquire customers, how quickly do we earn that money back? And I would say the typical metric has been customer acquisition cost versus lifetime value. But at Series B stage, you often don't have that much solid information about lifetime value yet, which is why they more often look at break even, like when do you earn it back? And typically benchmarks are, if it's less than 6 months, you're in great territory. If it's less than 12 months, you're okay. If it's more than 18 months, you're probably in the red territory, because then it doesn't come back fast enough. So those are the three metrics. I would say later on, Series C, then we start looking a lot more at things like overall operational efficiency, things like that. But that's probably not Series B yet.
Camille, a VP of marketing from Paris, wants to know, how should marketing strategies evolve as a startup moves from early stage to mid stage?
Oh, very good question, Camille. I would say early stage, what I've found the most effective is simply founder marketing. Let the founder be the brand, let the founder be the voice. At that stage, they're probably the key salesperson anyway. So you might as well shoot a few videos and get them out there on social media. essentially just selling their vision to the broader market. I would not invest all that much in like more traditional brand assets and things like that. That's just too early at that stage. Then I think it becomes in early mid stage, it becomes a question of providing a lot of air cover for the growing sales team, right? So there'll be more attention to collateral, but also to inbound campaign setups. The website becomes quite important, social media channels, and some maybe search advertising. I would say at a later stage, it becomes really important to make that switch to outbound, right? So where the sales team now has a much clearer view on who is our ICP, who is our core target group that we need to conquer. And that cannot just be dealt with inbound anymore. So then you're going to go into like literal outbound campaigns all the way from awareness through, desire, interest, and ultimately action. And that will have a much heavier marketing component where essentially the salesperson only comes in relatively late in the funnel.
Okay. Very helpful. Let's go with another VP of marketing from Los Angeles. This is Gabriella. How do you balance customer acquisition with customer retention as you get into later stage startups?
Okay, I think it's a very good question, especially coming from a marketer. Most startups do underestimate how important it is to get more revenue, same revenue first and then more revenue from existing customers. So especially in any business model related to SaaS, software as a service, you can see that a lot of the revenue comes from existing customers staying, expanding, maybe upping the price at some point in time that they pay per seat. And so I would say that it really is about a balance. I think the question is phrased right. You need to look at, is there a sizable component of your revenue coming back from existing customers, not just from revenue, but from revenue growth? But also, are you acquiring enough new logos? Even if maybe today they're not providing you with a lot of new revenue, will they become part of that pool that will expand over time? So I think we've got experience with customers that are in either situations. One was typically relying a lot on existing customers, always expanding, but they were hardly acquiring any new logos. And there we really challenged them and said, well, if your ideal customer profile is this, then why do you have so few of them? How many do you think you can find on LinkedIn? And they said, well, maybe 50. And we found 10,000 right there in the workshop. So that made them very excited about trying to hunt for new logos. Also works the other way around when companies are constantly hiring or getting new customers to sign up, but there's something wrong with the product or with customer retention, and it's a leaky bucket. It really is about a balance.
I think really well said. And I think that whole vision of who you think your ideal customer is, how many of them you have and how many are out there, and especially as you move what we would call into the mid stage, really looking at that and again coming up with those hypotheses and testing them is really critical, and not believing what was true 18 months ago is still true for the business, because things change.
Really, maybe one aspect I can highlight as well. I believe it was Gabriella was a marketer, right, in Los Angeles. So from a marketing perspective in particular, I also think that means you cannot just focus your marketing on only acquiring new logos, which is what happens almost all the time. There's a sizable marketing component that could go into existing customers, reinforcing that they made the right choice, making them aware of other functionality or benefits that they are not aware of, and that might let them to sign up for a higher level product, for example, and also testimonials that can help a lot to reinforce that they made the right choice and that they're with the right leader in that market.
I'm not even going to mention this person's name. They are in Singapore because they ask a juicy question. I really appreciate it. What are the key indicators that a founder should consider when bringing in a new professional CEO?
Oh, that is a good thing that you didn't mention any name there, I guess, with such a sensitive question.
Yes.
Key indicators when founders are considering bringing in a professional CEO?
Yes.
Okay, so one, I think it's perfectly valid for a founder to consider stepping down as CEO, but I also think it needs a lot of discussion, typically with what is the reason behind it. Is it imposter syndrome? Is it lack of confidence? Is it because the board wants them to change? So to be very clear of those reasons. Why do I say that? Because those are the very reasons that will help you understand, well, how do I then find a person who's better at this stuff than I am, right? And too often it's kind of like an emotional situation where anyone who comes across as more confident will simply seem a lot more attractive. But in reality, once that person has joined, it turns out the confidence was just superficiality, and they did not actually have the experience nor the charisma inside the company to do a better job as CEO. So I think there's a lot more to be said before you even go into metrics, to be honest. Like, why would you want to change? What's the key reason to change? And is this indeed a better alternative than just having that founder stay in place as CEO and learn more of the chops of what it takes at that stage? Maybe I'm biased here, Doug, but the reason why we founded Midstage Institute was primarily to help founders stay in place for as long as possible as the CEO of their companies, of their growing startups, if they want to. And of course, on the condition that they learn to do what it takes to run a company that's growing bigger and bigger and has different needs.
Okay, I think really well said. And I think it's really important, as opposed to just jumping to the solution of, oh, we need a new CEO. It's really about what is needed to get the company to the next level. And then are there internal resources, are there external resources? Are there potentially coaching consultants, other things, fractional people who could help? But I think,
Yeah, thank you.
similar
Thank you for calling that out, Doug, because I think that's so often an underlying value of why a coach can be helpful, right? Like, naturally, we all jump to solutions right away. We don't even think of, is this the right question I'm asking? And you and I see all the time with the startups we work with that people have all the answers, but what they don't have is the right questions to be asked, right? And just getting people to step back a little bit and say, well, what question are you really asking? What really is the problem that you're trying to solve? It'll make for so much more effective solutions than if they jumped into the first thing that came into their head right away.
Right. Yeah. I couldn't agree with that more. I think the other thing is, if you tie it back to what we talked to about accountability, like on the marketing side of leads, I sometimes find that sometimes the question becomes early in companies' developments, the CEO or founding team's personal kind of needs and drive for the business match really well with what the business needs.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, as the business expands, maybe the things that personally get the founding team really excited to show up for work are not the same things that the business needs. So sometimes just having them reflect on what are they doing to satisfy their own internal needs for maybe intellectual, or I could say emotional stimulation, versus is that the most important thing for the business? And many times just having the founder reflect on that and separate those two things out, they then can perform at a much, much higher level and then implement a system like our velocity system or another one.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to being a parent. I'm not a parent myself, but I have many friends who are, of course, and where in the beginning you probably just see your own, project your own personality into that child, whereas then very soon you have to learn they're their own individual. They're going to make their own way in life. And yeah, you can help them and guide them, but what you need out of life is very different from what your kid may want.
I love that. Let's end with one last question, just a little bit more maybe of an upbeat team focus.
Great.
AO, I hope I pronounced that correctly, from London, who's chief of staff, asked, how can we maintain the company culture while rapidly expanding the team? And I would just ask, is the right thing to maintain the company culture or to refine it or to adapt it? Like, how do you think about that, Roland?
Yeah, I think both are really good questions. So one, I do feel that in many startups, the culture is such an important asset for why people join and why they're often engaged and happy at a startup, that it needs to feel like you are maintaining and strengthening that culture. It's usually not that constructive to say, okay, we're going to change the entire culture, right? That's what will set people up for failure. However, I also think your point is very valid. You need to look at what parts of the culture are still going to help us moving forward, and what parts of the culture do we appreciate but are not that helpful anymore. As an example, many startups have this culture of extreme speed and agility, like always jumping on the latest thing coming in. And that is, of course, what makes you successful at an early stage, but it may not actually make you super successful when you're in the mid stage, where you need to focus on more repeatable processes, things that can be done without thinking by many folks, right? And so at that time, you can often say, well, let's rephrase this a little bit. Let's maybe combine a few of our values into one. And almost always I see the most successful evolution of culture, maybe that's the best way of saying it, as they often start with 8 or 10 values from the outset. And simply as the company grows bigger, you don't add, you just subtract and combine, right? So it becomes easier and easier to just say, well, really what matters is just these 3 big clusters. And I've seen the greatest success at companies just evolving their culture that way, seemingly making it simpler, thereby getting even more buy-in from folks, but also then maybe silently retiring some aspects of the culture that are not that helpful anymore.
So, Roland, something that I did not plan when asking this question, but you really teased out of my brain, is we had a former client who one of their core values was hustle. And I remember that they wanted any inbound lead followed up on within 20 minutes. They wanted a phone call and an email and a text message, any inbound lead that came in, and they wanted it done by a salesperson, because that had built them to about 8 million in revenue, if you remember that client.
Amazing, right?
But then what happened is they got stuck there.
Yeah.
Because they were distracting some of their best sellers with questionable quality leads, because they were doing lead scoring, and they couldn't expand in their big accounts. And when they suddenly, I think they actually just put an SDR in place. They still wanted to maintain that, but they focused that hustle, so it maybe wasn't manic and impacting the entire sales team, to screen all of those things. They could still keep that hustle, but contain it, so their senior sellers could really focus on expanding multi-million-dollar relationships, and that then unlocked the growth. And I think that was, a way of evolving how you implement your core values, as well as evolving them over time.
Yeah, and this is actually the brilliant thing about values, right? That over time they can be reinterpreted and re-implemented in a different way. I'm sure they still have that value of hustle. It's just that it wasn't set as a goal, just like we said earlier in this office hours, that you need to change your goals over time. You cannot just assume they can stay stable and that'll always work.
Excellent. I've got to run to an actual client call. I know, Roland, you've got a hard stop too, but I wanted to thank everyone for joining today. Roland, thank you for sharing everything. Thank you all who sent in questions before and put them into the chat. And I hope everyone has an amazing evening, amazing morning, amazing afternoon. And then, Roland, if they want to get in touch with us outside of office hours, what's the best way?
The best way is just to send a message on LinkedIn. I'm Roland Sibling, and Doug Miller also is on LinkedIn, of course. And we will be back in touch.
Awesome. Everybody have a wonderful evening, day, or morning. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.